March 14, 1935, 9:52 p.m. The Cotton Club's back room was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Dutch Schultz, the most violent gangster in New York, stood in the middle of Bumpy Johnson's territory, surrounded by Bumpy's men, and did something that nobody had ever done before. He looked Bumpy dead in the eyes, hawked up a wad of spit, and let it splatter on the polished wooden floor, right at Bumpy's feet. The room went silent. 20 men reached for their guns. One word from Bumpy and Dutch Schultz would be dead before his body hit the ground. But Bumpy didn't say a word. He just smiled. A small, patient smile that made Dutch Schultz's blood run cold, though he didn't know why yet. What Dutch Schultz didn't understand, what nobody in that room understood, was that Bumpy Johnson's silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of the most calculated destruction of a criminal empire in New York history. And it would all happen without Bumpy firing a single shot. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Dutch Schultz was in 1935. His real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, a German Jewish kid from the Bronx who'd clawed his way to the top of New York's underworld through pure, unrelenting brutality. Dutch didn't negotiate. Dutch didn't compromise. Dutch killed anyone who got in his way and slept like a baby afterward. By 1935, Dutch Schultz controlled the numbers racket in the Bronx, most of Manhattan, and he had his eyes on the biggest prize of all, Harlem. The numbers game in Harlem was worth millions. Poor black folks betting pennies and nickels on 3-digit numbers, and those pennies added up to a fortune. Dutch wanted every cent of it. But there was a problem. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but everyone called him Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was only 29 years old, but he'd already survived things that would have killed most men. He'd done time in prison, fought his way through gang wars, and built a network of loyalty that stretched from 110th Street to 155th Street. He wasn't the biggest gangster in Harlem. That title belonged to Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madame Queen. But Bumpy was her enforcer, her right hand, and everyone knew that crossing Bumpy meant crossing the entire Harlem underworld. Dutch Schultz didn't care about any of that. He'd taken on the Italian mob and won. He'd fought the Irish gangs and won. He'd even gone to war with the federal government over tax evasion and walked away free. To Dutch, Bumpy Johnson was just another obstacle, another body waiting to be buried. The confrontation at the Cotton Club wasn't an accident. Dutch had planned it for weeks. He wanted to send a message, not just to Bumpy, but to all of Harlem. He wanted everyone to know that Dutch Schultz was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop him. Dutch walked into the Cotton Club with 6 of his best men. They weren't there for the music. They pushed through the crowd, past the famous bandstand where Duke Ellington had played just nights before, and made their way to the back room where Bumpy was having a meeting with some of Harlem's most important businessmen. The door swung open. Dutch Schultz stood in the doorway, his pale face twisted into that famous sneer, his eyes scanning the room like a predator sizing up prey. "Bumpy," a voice said from the table. "We have a visitor." Bumpy didn't look up from his drink. He knew who it was. He'd been expecting this moment for months. Dutch walked in like he owned the place. His men fanned out behind him, hands near their weapons. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "So you're Bumpy Johnson," Dutch said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I expected someone bigger, someone more impressive. You look like a shoeshine boy who got lost." Bumpy's men bristled, but Bumpy held up his hand. "Steady. Let the man talk." Dutch laughed. "Let the man talk? That's good. That's real good. You hear that, boys? He's letting me talk, like he's got a choice." Dutch walked closer, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. He stopped about 3 feet from Bumpy's table, close enough to smell the whiskey on Bumpy's breath. "Here's how this is gonna work," Dutch said. "You're gonna tell Madame Queen that the numbers in Harlem belong to me now. Every runner, every banker, every penny that changes hands, that's mine. You can keep working, but you work for me. You take orders from me, and you give me 60% of everything." Bumpy finally looked up. His eyes were calm, almost bored. "And if I say no?" Dutch smiled. "That's when you die. Your mother dies, your sister dies, everyone you ever loved dies. And then I take everything anyway. So really, saying yes is just the smart play." The room was silent. Every man in that room knew what Dutch Schultz was capable of. They'd heard the stories, the murders, the torture, the bodies that never got found. Dutch wasn't bluffing. He never bluffed. And that's when Dutch did it. He looked at Bumpy, hawked up a wad of spit, and let it splatter on the floor right at Bumpy's feet. It was the ultimate disrespect. In the streets, spitting on a man's territory was the same as spitting in his face. It was a challenge, a declaration of war, a statement that you were nothing, less than nothing, not even worth the effort of a bullet. Every gun in the room came half out of its holster, 20 men ready to turn Dutch Schultz into Swiss cheese. But Bumpy just smiled, that small, patient smile. "Mr. Schultz," Bumpy said quietly, "I appreciate you coming all this way to introduce yourself. Now I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Dutch's smile faltered, just for a second. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you can leave now, same way you came in. Door's right behind you." Dutch stared at Bumpy for a long moment, trying to read him, trying to figure out if this was bravery or stupidity. He couldn't tell, and that uncertainty, that tiny seed of doubt, would grow into something that would destroy everything Dutch Schultz had ever built. "This ain't over," Dutch said finally. "Not by a long shot." "No," Bumpy agreed. "It's not." Dutch and his men left the Cotton Club that night thinking they'd won. They'd walked into Bumpy's territory, disrespected him in front of his own people, and walked out alive. To Dutch, that was victory. But Bumpy Johnson understood something that Dutch Schultz never would. Violence is loud. Revenge is patient. Over the next 6 months, Bumpy didn't declare war. He didn't send assassins. He didn't fight Dutch Schultz in the streets. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He made phone calls. See, Dutch Schultz had made a lot of enemies over the years. The Italian mob hated him because he was unstable, unpredictable, bad for business. The Irish gangs hated him because he'd killed their people. The federal government hated him because he'd embarrassed them in court. And every small-time operator in New York hated him because he'd stolen their territories, killed their friends, and showed them nothing but contempt. Bumpy reached out to all of them, not to form an alliance. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, he shared information. He let people know where Dutch's money was coming from, which judges Dutch had bought, which cops were on Dutch's payroll. He fed pieces of intelligence to federal prosecutors. He tipped off rival gangs about Dutch's shipments. He made sure that every enemy Dutch had ever made knew exactly where to hurt him. The effect was devastating. Dutch's operation started falling apart. Shipments got hijacked. Money went missing. Trusted men got arrested on charges that seemed to come out of nowhere. Dutch was bleeding from 1,000 small cuts, and he couldn't figure out where they were coming from. But Bumpy's masterpiece, the move that would go down in criminal history, involved a man named Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey was an ambitious prosecutor who'd made his name taking down organized crime. He was smart, ruthless, and completely incorruptible. The mob had tried to bribe him. They'd tried to threaten him. Nothing worked. Dewey was on a mission, and his next target was Dutch Schultz. When Dutch found out that Dewey was building a case against him, he did what Dutch always did. He decided to kill the problem. Dutch announced at a meeting of the National Crime Syndicate that he was going to have Thomas Dewey assassinated. The room went silent. Killing a federal prosecutor was insane. It would bring the full weight of the government down on organized crime. It would destroy everything the syndicate had built. But Dutch didn't care. Dutch only knew one way to solve problems. What nobody knew was that Bumpy Johnson had known about Dutch's plan before Dutch even announced it. One of Bumpy's informants had been in a meeting where Dutch discussed the idea. Bumpy made sure that information got to the right people, specifically to Lucky Luciano and the other heads of the syndicate. The vote was unanimous. Dutch Schultz had to go. October 23, 1935. 7 months after Dutch spit on the floor of Bumpy's club, Dutch was eating dinner at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. His bodyguards were with him, but they weren't expecting trouble. This was supposed to be a safe place, a meeting spot where Dutch could relax. At 10:15 p.m., 2 men walked into the restaurant. They didn't hesitate. They pulled out pistols and started shooting. Dutch's bodyguards went down first. Then the shooters turned their guns on Dutch himself. He took multiple bullets, including one to the abdomen that would prove fatal. Dutch Schultz died in the hospital 2 days later. He spent his final hours in a fevered delirium, babbling incoherently about money and enemies and someone who'd betrayed him. The police stenographer who recorded his dying words said they made no sense, just the ravings of a dying madman. But there was one phrase Dutch kept repeating over and over in his final hours. The quiet one. The quiet one got me. The newspapers reported Dutch's death as a mob hit, which it was. They reported it was ordered by the syndicate, which it was. But what the newspapers never reported What history never recorded was the role Bumpy Johnson played in making it all happen. Bumpy never pulled a trigger. He never ordered a hit. He simply shared information, made connections, and let Dutch Schultz's own nature do the rest. He knew that Dutch was too violent, too erratic, too proud to ever back down from a fight. He knew that sooner or later, Dutch would do something so crazy that even his allies would turn against him. All Bumpy had to do was wait and give a gentle push at the right moment. The night after Dutch Schultz died, Bumpy was back at the Cotton Club. He sat at the same table where Dutch had spit on the floor 7 months earlier. The same men who'd been there that night were there now, watching him. Bumpy raised his glass of whiskey. "To Dutch Schultz," Bumpy said quietly. "A man who didn't know when to shut up." The room laughed. But it was nervous laughter, because everyone in that room understood what they'd witnessed. They'd watched Bumpy Johnson dismantle the most dangerous gangster in New York without ever raising his voice, without ever firing a shot, without ever doing anything that could be traced back to him. Dutch Schultz had walked into the Cotton Club thinking violence was power. He'd spit on the floor thinking fear was respect. He'd threatened Bumpy's family thinking brutality was strength. He was wrong about all of it. Real power, the kind of power that builds empires and destroys enemies, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with threats and violence. Real power is quiet. It's patient. It watches and waits and moves pieces on a board that other people can't even see. Dutch Schultz brought a machine gun to a chess match, and Bumpy Johnson, the quiet one, checkmated him without ever leaving his chair. After Dutch's death, the Harlem numbers racket was reorganized. Madame Queen eventually retired, and Bumpy Johnson rose to become the undisputed king of Harlem. He would hold that position for decades, surviving assassination attempts, prison sentences, and challenges from the Italian mob, all because he understood something that most gangsters never figured out. The loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous. The most dangerous man is the one who smiles when you spit at his feet and says nothing at all, because that man isn't scared. That man is planning. Years later, when people asked Bumpy about that night at the Cotton Club, about how he'd felt when Dutch Schultz disrespected him in front of his own people, Bumpy would just smile that same patient smile. "You know what I was thinking when Dutch spit on my floor?" Bumpy would say. "I was thinking about how long it would take to clean it up after he was gone. Not very long, as it turned out." Dutch Schultz died screaming in a hospital bed, surrounded by strangers, his empire in ruins, betrayed by the very people he thought were his allies. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, at the age of 62, surrounded by family and friends, revered as a legend, mourned by an entire community. One man ruled through violence, the other ruled through wisdom. History remembers them both, but only one of them got to choose how his story ended. And if you're watching this and thinking about the lessons here, let me break it down real simple. Dutch Schultz thought he was sending a message when he spit on that floor. He thought he was showing strength. He was wrong. All he showed was that he didn't understand the game he was playing. He didn't understand that Bumpy Johnson had been studying him for months, learning his weaknesses, mapping his relationships, identifying the pressure points that would bring him down. When Dutch walked out of that Cotton Club, he thought he'd won the battle. He didn't realize he'd already lost the war. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't playing the same game Dutch was playing. Dutch was playing checkers, moving pieces one at a time, taking whatever was in front of him. Bumpy was playing chess, thinking 5, 10, 15 moves ahead, seeing patterns that Dutch couldn't even imagine. The spit on the floor wasn't an insult to Bumpy. It was a gift. It confirmed everything Bumpy already suspected about Dutch Schultz. It showed that Dutch was arrogant, impulsive, and incapable of seeing beyond his own ego. It showed that Dutch would eventually self-destruct if given enough rope. So Bumpy gave him all the rope he needed, and Dutch hanged himself with it. That's the lesson of that night at the Cotton Club. That's the lesson of Bumpy Johnson's entire life. Violence is easy. Anyone can pull a trigger. But winning, really winning, means understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves. It means being patient when everyone else is panicking. It means staying silent when everyone expects you to scream. Dutch Schultz spit on the floor of Bumpy's club and thought he was the predator. He was the prey. He just didn't know it yet. Now, if this story got you thinking, do me a favor, smash that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Next week, we're telling the story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into Lucky Luciano's office completely unarmed and walked out with the deal that made him king of Harlem. You don't want to miss that. Drop a comment and let me know. Could you have stayed silent if someone spit at your feet? What would you have done? Remember, in Harlem, The loudest voice didn't win. The smartest one did. And Bumpy Johnson was always the smartest man in any room he walked into.